So in the last video, we created the simple and slightly crappy risk table in Google Sheets. And while that was pretty awesome because it was really simple and really easy to create, the sad news, unfortunately, is that it's not quite enough for ISO 14971 compliance. Because as always, the regulatory people, they love over-engineering, and the risk management is no exception to regulatory over-engineering. That being said, it's not the worst of all standards. So most of the requirements are pretty straightforward. And now we just have to see what our nice and simple Google Sheet is actually missing in contrast to what the standard requires. And again, most regulatory consultants would be happy to make this extremely complex and bill you many hours for explaining this very complex topic in many hours. But luckily, it's actually not that complex. So, and I'm not trying to sell you regulatory consulting. I'm only trying to sell you our software. So that's why we will look at our software, how to do risk management in the most efficient way as possible. And regardless whether you use our software or not, I think it's a pretty cool tool to simply learn this risk management stuff. All right, so we have the pretty simple risk analysis here. And just to recap, we found different risks here of our depression treatment app, like for example, wrong medical content leading to worsening of depression. For each of these items, we came up with a probability. We tried to estimate that. We came up with a severity of the harm, like how bad is it if someone has a worsening of depression, and whether this combination is acceptable. Like, is it acceptable for it to be unlikely to cause a worsening of depression, which is medium severe in our case. And we determined that, yes, this is acceptable. And again, it depends on your product. Now, this seems like very arbitrary, that we just kind of like take this combination and go like, yes, this is acceptable. So we need a bit more of a systematic approach where we take all the probabilities and all the severities and we map them to each other. And we like determine, is it acceptable or not? The first step, of course, is that the probability actually has to become a bit more concrete. Like, what is unlikely? Is it like 1%? Is it 0.1%? So we don't really know, but like one idea could be maybe it's 0.01% to 1%, right? So that moves, that's like a band, like a spectrum of probabilities. It's 0.01% to 1%, so 10 to the power of 2 in between. So if something's like 1% probable or 0.01% probable, or in between, then we classify this as unlikely. That's just something I came up with. You can come up with your own ideas, but and I've seen all sorts of crazy calculation approaches and risk analysis, but this, in my opinion, is the most sane approach to actually use percentages, because that's what real math people use for probabilities. And regulatory people, unfortunately, very often don't use these useful math things. All right, so because this is the same category, it would have the same percentage here. And let's actually just make it a bit more simple. Let's make this like probable. So that would kind of like just be 100% to 1%. So we would have like, we wouldn't have a gap in our probabilities, right? So if something's like 1% probable, well, then we actually run into this problem, right? Because now it could be unlikely or it could be probable because our categories are overlapping at 1%. So it's kind of like, the question is like how you define your, well, it's a question of definition. So to make this even simpler, we should probably do something like, this is super not clean, but that's basically the idea. Okay, so if something's 1% probable, it's in this unlikely category. If something's more than 1% probable, it's in the probable category. So 2%, for example, 10%, and so on. And in between, it's very easy. If something's 0.1% probable, it's in the unlikely category. It's in the middle, more or less. Okay, so we defined that, and that makes things easier for us because for every new entry which comes in now, we can kind of like estimate the percentage in the sense of like what's the probability, and then we can sort it into these categories which we created. We just created these two categories, so that's pretty easy. And we could also, of course, introduce a third category which is even less likely than unlikely. And for the severity, we would also need to go into detail a bit more, like what does medium mean? It could be like maybe reversible medical harm, for example. Like something like a worsening of depression, that's medical harm, but maybe it's reversible. This is maybe like I don't know, reversible non-medical harm. I don't know, like reversible medical harm, or like kind of like low-grade medical harm. Again, it kind of like depends on your device, and this maybe you could just say irreversible medical harm. So again, I'm kind of like coming up with things here. But again, okay, so you need, and by the way, there's actually a mistake I already made, right? So we're using the same category here, and then we would need to use the same definition. So yes, let's use this same definition. Okay. Now, this was the first step. So now you kind of like have to like make probabilities more concrete. We did that. We have to define the severities. We also did that. And now we actually have to like define some sort of like guideline or definition, how each combination, whether it is acceptable or not. So you would have to like say on this side, you would have like all the probabilities, probable, unlikely. And then here you would have like the severities where you say like low, medium. Okay, and then what do we do here? So we said unlikely and medium is acceptable. Unlikely medium is yes, acceptable. And then you have unlikely low is also yes. Probable medium is no. And this is up for grabs. We still need to like define that, but let's not do that now. But okay, I hope you understand this so far. So now we kind of like came up with this definition of like, okay, we have probabilities of like how likely is something going to happen in our medical device, and like severities, like how bad is the thing which is going to happen in our medical device. And each combination, is it acceptable or not for us as a company, or for this product, or for the certain for the patient we aim to treat. So if something's, for example, if something's unlikely, we say it's always acceptable for this to happen, regardless of whether it's a low or medium severity thing which is going to happen. And again, we define low and medium severity thing as reversible medical harm or reversible low-grade medical harm. So kind of like reversible stuff. And then now we also have the other probability. If something's more likely, if it's probable, and for example, it has a medium grade of harm, we say, no, this is actually not acceptable for us as a company. And again, this completely depends on your medical device. For example, for like a cardiac pacemaker, it might be super acceptable to maybe cause severe harm in a very unlikely amount of cases. Like maybe if it malfunctions and it kills someone because the heart stops beating, that might be acceptable if the probability is extremely low. If you kind of like weigh that against maybe all the lives you save because the cardiac pacemaker exists and works properly. But that's kind of like discussion you have to have for each device individually. And I mean, right now we're looking at a smartphone app, so probably it's not okay to cause death, regardless of how unlikely it is. So again, it depends on your device. All right, so now we did this table, and this table is actually called a risk matrix. And you have to define a risk matrix for ISO 14971 compliance. And this is starting to become really tedious because we just did this really simple example with 2 severity categories and 2 probability categories. But as you can see, for example, we're not covering a lot of probabilities. Sure, we're covering 100% down to 1%, and then that down to 0.01%. But what if something's like 0.001% likely? Then currently we are actually screwed, right? Because we are underneath this unlikely category. So we need to like add more categories here. And we might need to add more severities on this side too, because maybe our software or our product might be able to also cause severe harm here. And then we have to add more stuff, and we have to analyze all of these combinations. Just like we haven't analyzed this probable low combination, we need to analyze all the other future combinations here. And I hope you understand what I'm getting at, because this is starting to become really clunky. Also, just coming up with this is not always that easy. Okay, well, now comes the point where I'm going to try to sell you our software, because our software automates most of this, and I think it's pretty awesome. You can still continue doing this in Google Sheets, and then probably you will end up with something which looks just as crappy as what I just produced. So just for the sake of actually learning risk management, let me show you how it looks in our software. So even if you decide against it, you understood risk management, which I think would be pretty cool. We just saw this table, so is there a better way to create this table? The answer is yes. If you navigate to our eQMS software Formwork, you can see I'm in the product section right now, and I already created a product. So watch the other videos to kind of like see what we did there. I created, for example, these software requirements like, hey, show a notification to users and authenticate users, these two software requirements, which is pretty cool. I didn't do anything in the risk section yet, so now we're going to look at that. And we just talked about this thing called risk matrix, and that's exactly what I want to show you now. Okay, so all of this has been automatically created by the software for us. So far I didn't do anything here. And all of this looks a bit clunky, so I'll just skip it and then show you some fancy stuff because this is more colorful. And this is really, really cool. Okay, so what do we have here? We essentially have here exactly all of the stuff which we just manually created, except that Formwork, our software, created this automatically for you. On the left side are probabilities. And if you go back to the Google Sheet, you can see, yes, on the left side, we also have probabilities. And here, the columns, they are severities. So minor reversible damage, minor damage with required medical intervention, and so on, and death. So you can see these are also more sophisticated definitions than my unsophisticated definitions here. So again, these are the columns which we just defined here. These are like kind of like the medical harms which are happening to patients. And now you can see the really cool thing is that Formwork allows you to define whether each of these combinations is acceptable or not. Just how we like made decisions here. So yes would be green and no would be red because it's not acceptable. And that's exactly what Formwork has here. And it just like created some like sensible defaults for you. And based on our audit experience, this is roughly the structure which your risk matrix should have, and we just like give you that for free, so that's pretty cool. But you can edit all of that if you like. So for example, if I want to say like, well, with my super special cardiac pacemaker device, maybe it's okay to cause death in a very unlikely scenario. So I just click here and change it, and that's it. It's already saved. But as we're doing a smartphone app, that's actually not accepted to cause death. And now, hopefully, it also makes sense to look at the stuff which was above here, because now we probably understand it better. So we have four probability categories here. And if we go up, we can see, yes, these are those 4 probability categories. And just as we did in our spreadsheet, these always span certain probabilities in the sense of, well, you could call them percentages. This is like 100% probability to 0.01, and then 0.01 to, and then minus 10 to the power of 2. So you always have these bands of 10 to the power of 2 in between these probabilities. By the way, Formwork actually solved this mapping problem. What is it? What happens if something is 0.01 probable? In this case, Formwork does the conservative estimate that it always moves up, and then it assumes it is more likely. So if something's 0.01 probable, it is in the category number 1 here. That's something I coded back in the Stone Age when I was still writing Formwork code. Man, those were the good times. All right, moving on to the severity categories. You can see Formwork created these 4 severity categories for us, and those you can see here at the top. And that's pretty cool. The even cooler thing is you can edit any of these things. So maybe, let's say, like you say like, oh, deaf is not super practical for us to have because we want to do a smartphone app. So you could just do like, replace it with something else. So you could maybe say, so this was major irreversible damage. Maybe let's do major irreversible damage with required medical intervention and, I don't know, lasting disability or so, or whatever. Okay, save this. And you see it has already been edited here, which I think is super awesome. Let's change it back to deaf. Save it again. And yeah, this is super fast and super intuitive. I may be biased though. Okay, so we have this risk matrix. How does it fit into all of the other stuff? That's what we're going to be talking about next. But I hope this was clear so far. Why are we doing this, by the way? It's because the 14971 requires it from us. But to be fair, this does make quite a lot of sense because, to recap, we created this systematic approach of checking our risk table, like which severities do we have, which probabilities do we have, and what are the numbers of those. And if we kind of like write all of them down and map their combinations, which of these things do we deem acceptable? And that's exactly what we did. And now we're switching to Formwork, because Formwork is kind of like way more intuitive to do this than Formwork. Then, I mean, imagine doing this in Google Sheets. This is kind of like hell, especially with all the other stuff we want to document on top of this and get some super nice automations and efficiency optimizations out of that. But your task for now is think about this for your own device. Start out with the Formwork free risk matrix, which you just get for free when you create a new product in Formwork, and then kind of like think about what specific changes you might need to make for your device. And most likely, my guess is, don't change the probability categories, because I mean, they already cover you from 1 to 0, and it's very unlikely you need more than 4. It's very unlikely you need different bands than what we give you here. So probably just take these. But the severity categories you might want to review. For example, if it's a smartphone app, you might not want to have death. But otherwise, also the number of these is also pretty decent already. Like 4 categories is usually pretty sufficient to pass an audit. It might also depend on your auditors. Some auditors really want to see death here, because they're like, yeah, what's the worst possible thing that could happen? It could be like the smartphone exploding or whatever. Like, yeah, sure. But again, auditors, unfortunately, are not very tech savvy. But again, so go through this risk matrix, look at the severity categories, think about it regarding your own device, save it, and maybe you might be done with this in 10 minutes. It would be great. And then in the next video, we'll actually see which other things we have to document and transfer out from our very simple spreadsheet risk analysis. All right, that's it. Stay tuned. See you in the next video.